I'm going to try to be brief, and try to solve a puzzle that that a lot of us have encountered, and it simply put is why Foucault calls this series of lectures on ordoliberalism and Chicago School neoliberalism the birth of biopolitics, when it doesn't seem to have any direct relationship to his other statements on biopower and biopolitics. But to get there, I want to take it by way of sort of three maybe discourse networks or discourse themes, to take Kittler's phrasing there. I'll go from Neoliberalism 2000, which I'll call the rebirth of biocapital. Then I'll trace the genealogy back to the early 20th century, the end of the 19th century, what I'm going to call pre-neoliberalism, which I'll address in terms of the ethic of entrepreneurialism. And then I'll end with some speculations on what I'll call post-neoliberalism to 1000, just to keep the symmetry of the 100-year sequences, which I'll call the deployment of dream work, in which I will draw on some Freud there. So by the rebirth of biocapital, I'm sort of beginning more or less where Antony left off, that the shock doctrine and other formulations of 20th century capitalism and 21st century capitalism are largely theories of biocapital, how to kick a dying or sick organism, the capitalist world system, into motion again. So I think we need to go back to some really poignant and important formulations by Nicholas Rose and Roberto Esposito. Rose states that in advanced neoliberal democracies, biological identity becomes bound up with more general norms of enterprising, self-actualizing, responsible personhood. Individuals who identify themselves and their community through their biology challenge the vectors that lead from biological imperfection or abnormality to stigmatization or exclusion. They demand civil and human rights for those whose lives previously were deemed less worthy of life. Of course, Rose takes that in the direction of movements for the rights of particular racial groups, age categories, sexual identities, but also illness and ability. Groups, communities organized around identities of concerning those biological categories. At the end of his book, 2000 book on the politics of life itself, he addresses the larger issue, but only in a few pages, of the birth of biocapital, namely the medicalized enclosure of the biological commons, including its genetic aspects. So there, I think is the link to post 2000, particularly discussions of neoliberalism in its economic dimensions. Harvey's formulation of capital as accumulation by dispossession, and what we've heard in the last few days of these cycles of labor, capital, and state realignment and co-optation of processes of commodification and industrial instrumental rationalization. Now, if you take that back and just start digging through the archives of the social sciences, the social and psychological sciences, as Roberto Esposito starts to do in the first chapter of his book, Bios, then you can see that in the 20th century, there's already been several movements of rethinking capitalism in biological, naturalist, even medical terms. There's a German wave of organistic theories of the state in the 1920s and 30s. There's an Anglo-American genre of theories of self-regulating systems from the 1940s and 1910s, 1910s, and 1920s. And then there's a French organistic theories of social order in the 1960s and 70s, many of which use terms like biosociality, biopolitics, and so on. Now, Foucault seems to not be aware of these, or seems to be just shifting his focus for various reasons. But Esposito does give us at least the references there. And if you dig a bit deeper, you'd find people like Norbert Wiener, who Nikki talked about yesterday, his book on the human uses of the human. I forget what that's called, actually. There's a great quotation that she provided, which actually just fits with this, this biocapital model of accumulation through dispossession, I would say. But also figures like Irving Fisher, his book on national vitalism of 1907, his book on how to live, I love that, 1917, T.N. Carver, the economics of human energy of 1927. So, to move to my second point, okay. Pre-neoliberalism, sorry about the the double L, that's cool though, from 1900, the ethics of entrepreneurialism. So to trace the sources of this, I think we need to move back another 100 years to the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, Foucault already gives us a prescription for this in tracing the birth of biomedicine in an essay he wrote in 1974, and in the final part 5 of the History of Sexuality, where he talks about the task of the project of retasking and retraining, restraining the state rather, by subjecting it to the supervision of the market. Now, as he writes at that key passage in part 5 of the History of Sexuality, volume 1, the disciplines of the body and the regulations of populations constituted the two poles around which the organization of power over life was deployed. So I take that as a key statement, and I think that is the starting point for the subsequent lectures on the birth of biopolitics, which he takes into the 20th century, mid-20th century, rather than exploring the developments of the biopolitical economy in the 19th century. To get more into what's happening then in the late 19th, early 20th century, I think it's useful to return to Paul Rabineau's 1996 essay on enlightenment and artificiality. So if we think of enlightenment in Foucault's terms as inventing not just the liberties, but also the disciplines, and we think of that both on the political and the economic dimension, then we're given a kind of research project of how to recover the biosocial foundations and dimensions of contemporary capitalism. This is what I think part of this is refiguring what Stephen was talking about in the last hour, the cultural fix of labor power, the dimension of fixed labor power. So Rabineau's statement here, many of you will be familiar with this, is if sociobiology constructed culture on the basis of a metaphor of nature, then in biosociality, nature is modeled on culture understood as practice. Nature is known and remade through technique and finally becomes artificial, just as culture becomes natural. I've actually sort of changed that quotation to put those latter statements from the future tense into the present tense when they could just as well be put into the past tense, because I actually think you could read this through the birth of social Darwinism and of the influence of the evolutionary Darwinian paradigm of social and natural life in the 19th century. And so that's what I do in this figure that I came up with, what I'm going to call the Neoliberal Dream Book, circa 1900, beginning with Spencer, supplemented by Zimmel, and that's really the focus of this larger paper, is the Zimmelian dimension of these of this birth of biocapital, I would say, and as well as Freud. And so I see that as see these people as sort of participating to a common paradigm, even if they're speaking different languages. So all of this, as I said, comes from or originates in Darwin, and I think chapter 1 of The Origin of Species, which is not on natural selection, but on artificial selection, variation under domestication, with the focus on the quaint example of the rock pigeon, Columbia olivia. I'm sure the British people in the audience know exactly why that matters. We don't in Canada. But the idea is that you can actually induce or you can induce variation under artificial conditions of domestic breeding. Okay, so you can produce different kinds of dogs and pigeons and cats and so on. Now, Spencer, I think, already had Herbert Spencer, an intimation of this, particularly in his Principles of Sociology, first edition 1874 with subsequent supplements and additions right up until 1896. As he says in a key passage, at the contrast between the militant and the industrial types is indicated by inverting the belief that individuals exist for the benefit of the state into the belief that the state exists for the benefit of individuals. So the contrast between the industrial type and the type likely to be involved from it is indicated by the inversion of the belief that life is for work to the belief that work is for life. My students love that passage. Okay, yeah, that's right. But we are here concerned with inductions derived from societies that have been and are and cannot enter into speculations respecting societies that may be. So this is a speculative sort of dream of the next phase or stage of evolution. If you put it into a quasi-pseudo-mathematical formula, you say that life begins with the organization of life, the organism. Organisms survive through selection. Okay? They compete with one another in an environment through struggle, and eventually then evolve into other species or other organisms. Okay? Now, Spencer's idea is that we're evolving towards a post-industrial world that doesn't just take work as its focus, but also life and pleasure and play and happiness, and that we do that through a kind of biological evolution. From an earlier and military type in which defense and immunity are the principles of survival and struggle, to a industrial type in which regulation and control are the principles of survival and struggle, and then finally to a kind of infinite development of coherent heterogeneity through growth and evolution. Now, you can find echoes of this in other figures of the 19th century and even the 1890s. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, her 1898 book, Women in Economics, basically a biological, evolutionary, Darwinian model of sex selection and race energies and the way they either produce or inhibit forms of natural expression. And you can find it in Durkheim's lectures from the 1890s on professional ethics and civic morals, in which state regulation is formulated as the presupposition for individual natural enhancement and development. So that would be further how I'm trying to develop this. But I think actually the key model for neoliberal thinking today has to be not model, but sort of a resource we need to recover is Zimmel's philosophy of money. First edition, 1900. Second edition, 1907, with several additions and revisions there. There he formulates competition as a civilized form of conflict, and in particular how market values render life, both social and individual life, as the central problem of existence. So if the 18th century was the problem of social equality, the 19th century, the problem of primarily individual liberty, the 20th century, he says, from the point of the philosophy of money to his later work up to 1918, addresses the problem of individual life. Okay, how do we enhance and foster individual life? Money then is a kind of proto-metaphor for the flux and fixity of life, as he says, in later works. I'm sort of drawing on Hans Blumenberg's great essay, which is just published in Theory, Culture, and Society, where he formulates this dilemma of money or life. And I think that's already, and he's saying that's already implicit, at least, in the philosophy of money. So I could also, let's read the Zimmel quote. The crux of the market is the general fact that money is everywhere conceived as purpose, and countless things that are really ends in themselves are thereby degraded to mere means. But since money itself is an omnipresent means, the various elements of our existence are thus placed in an all-embracing teleological nexus in which no element is either the first or the last. Furthermore, since money measures all objects with merciless objectivity, and since its standard of value so measured determines their relationship, a web of objective and personal aspects of life emerges, which is similar to the natural cosmos with its continuous cohesion and strict causality. This web is held together by the all-pervasive money value, bio-value, as Rose might put it, just as nature is held together by the energy that gives life to everything. Now, Zimmel and Spencer are each working on the idea of an analogy between social relations and organic and natural organization, organisms. So what I think Freud does, to move to the last part, how much time do I have?
About 4 minutes.
4 minutes, good. To move to the last part, is what Freud does, I think, is turn the analogy into analysis and turn the metaphor of the organism into a model for how the psyche and social life actually works in reality. So that's why I sort of formulated this neoliberal dream book in terms of what Jean Laplanche, rereading Freud, describes as the propping or binding of the biophysical plane of needs and instincts onto the sociocultural plane of desires and drives. So where I'm going with this is to rethink and reread this relationship of nature-culture, okay, this reconfiguration of nature-culture, which I think was decisive at the moment of Darwin's The Origin of Species in 1957, with the aftermath in Spencer, the vitalism of Zimmel and Bergson and others, and it's sort of medical and capitalist appropriation in the 20th century. I'm trying to read that through the concept of dream work. Okay, so I'm trying to say that trying to take seriously the notion of a kind of neoliberal dream work. So here my starting point is actually Jamie Peck's starting point in his book, in which he considers neoliberal constructions, and I think that's a useful psychoanalytic concept to think of neoliberalism as a construction in the Freudian sense, as a messy hybrid of ideology and utopia, of backward gazing and forward looking, of sober realism, capitalist realism, I guess, and unattainable idealism. To quote Peck here, neoliberalism has been associated with rolling programs. He means rolling back and rolling forward, rolling out. The state recedes and retreat and advances in different ways through the history of neoliberal reforms. So neoliberalism has been associated with rolling programs, back and out, of market-oriented reform, a kind of permanent revolution which cannot simply be judged according to its own fantasies of free market liberation. Now, I think it can partly be considered in terms of its fantasies of free market liberation. And that's what I'm trying to do by taking the concept of fantasy and dream work seriously with respect to Freud. Let's just read the Freud quote, and then I'll wrap up and tell you why I think this is a useful point of departure for finding a counter-rationality for neoliberalism. It thus seems plausible to suppose that in the dream work, a psychical force is operating which, on the one hand, strips the elements which have a high psychical value of their intensity, and on the other hand, by means of overdetermination, creates from elements of low psychical value new values, which afterwards find their way into the dream content. If that is so, a transference and displacement of psychical entities occurs in the process of dream formation. And it is a result of these that the text of the dream content and that of the latent dream thoughts comes about. The process which we are here presuming is nothing less than the essential portion of the dream work. And it deserves to be described as a dream displacement. Dream displacement, Traumverschiebung, and dream condensation, Traumverdichtung, are the two governing factors to whose activity we may in essence ascribe the form assumed by dreams. So where I'm going with this is back to Wendy Brown's statements from her nice essays from 2003 and 2005, where she's trying to diagnose, I would say, left melancholia. Okay? So I recommend these. They're extremely US bound. They hardly speak to any European or even Canadian context as far as I can see. But I think that the idea of thinking of neoliberalism through the logic, the incoherent and contradictory or counter-rationality of dream work is useful. And I think that's why I would like to pursue Jody Dean's proposal in her plenary to begin the conference of rethinking the concept of drives in particular. First, of course, we need to keep thinking and theorizing the problematic of desires, how they're disavowed and displaced, but also the concept of drives and their multiplicity, their plasticity, how they reverse, reflect, repress, sublimate different impulses. Okay, so I think to do that, then that would allow us to help us out of our left melancholia. What is melancholia for Freud? It's a kind of partial attachment and unconscious dependence which is disavowed. It's experienced then and takes the form of self-reproach and an ambivalence over what cannot be entirely hated or entirely eliminated. Thank you.